Good day, and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Hendersonville. My name is Chuck Elston, and I will serve as Worship Associate today. The UU Fellowship is an inclusive community of faith for all ages. Here you can bring your whole self, your full identity, no matter who you are, whom you love, or where you are on your journey. We extend to you a warm welcome. We invite you to join us in making the world a more just and peaceful place. Please join us at 11:30 this Sunday morning via Zoom for Stones of Compassion and conversations relating to today's message. As we move into the message part of today's service, we'll be revisiting one of our most famous of UU spiritual cousins, Waldo, his preferred name, Emerson. Our interim minister, Don Rollins, will offer a take on Emerson's life that goes to his more troubled side, the side that gives his work its true depth. Despite Emerson's own dismissal of quoting anyone, including himself, we nonetheless begin this short excerpt from his work. To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest achievement.
Hello everybody, this is Don Rollins. I'm the interim minister here at the UU Fellowship of Hendersonville, North Carolina. We are coming to you today from the minister's study in the office quarters here on campus. As always, glad you're with us. Today I want to talk about one of the headliners Unitarian Universalists have historically cited as one of our own. This despite the fact that he left our ministry twice and had an often tenuous relationship with the institutional Unitarianism of his day. To be honest, that's the same tenuous relationship I've had with Ralph Waldo Emerson himself. Rightly, wrongly, somewhere in between, he's been saddled with our movement's overemphasis on individualism. So I've kept my distance. But for whatever reason, COVID has me rereading some of the biographies on my shelves. And there it was, to my mind, still the best biography on Emerson and his times. So 2, not one sermons have resulted. Today's and one for December 20, because nothing says happy holidays like the life of a sullen genius and the next the shortest day of the year, eh? Out of sync with the liturgical calendar, I think Emerson's winter metaphor is worth the detour. So I hope you'll agree. And let's get started. At least 2 challenges confront anyone who would dare give a sermon on Ralph Waldo Emerson, Waldo as he preferred. First is the challenge to be as true as humanly possible. Our UU saints have a way of looking a lot like us, or even worse, superheroes. In Emerson's case, the Oracle of Concord, as he was later called, remains a complex study in what it is to be human. This, a century and a half after his death. The second challenge when approaching Emerson is to offer something worth adding to the mix. Be prepared to be amazed if you Google his name or consult the shelves of any decent library in the U.S., for the essays and the sermons and the theses and the dissertations and the books on him are as plentiful as copies of the Enquirer in the checkout line, heralded by everybody from the John Birchers to the John Kennedys. There's an Emerson for just about everybody. So if we're going to talk about Emerson, we need an angle. Otherwise, you might as well be given a book report. And my angle here is to move from knowing more about Emerson's writing and speaking to know about Emerson, our fellow human. Not an original approach, but I hope it's compelling. Jump on the time train with me back to 2006. That was the year that Doris Kearns Goodwin's book on Lincoln, Team of Rivals, was released. Goodwin's Lincoln cannot be appreciated without factoring for his chronic depression. And as with an earlier work from Joshua Wolf Schenck titled Lincoln's Melancholy, The goal is not for them to write a psychohistory, but to invite us to listen to Lincoln through his writings, his speeches, and his first-person account, to listen to Lincoln the sufferer. Because what they hear from his childhood through his assassination is the narrative of an exceptionally gifted but troubled soul. Accurate or not, there's a story told by the great Russian writer Tolstoy describing a trip through the Caucasus Mountains. Tolstoy encountered a remote tribe that had heard of Lincoln and considered him a champion for freedom. When Tolstoy showed their leader a photo of Lincoln, a member of the tribe remarked that his eyes are full of tears and his lips are sad with a secret sorrow. Schenck describes this sorrow as a melancholy that sometimes clouded Lincoln's judgment for weeks at a time, even causing him to consider suicide as the best way out. And while we tend to describe depression as a fundamental, paralyzing problem that must be treated, Schenck and Goodwin believed melancholy was the wellspring for Lincoln's work and leadership. And I begin with Lincoln because he was in some ways a soulmate to Emerson, burdened within as well as without by the twin loads of giftedness and an uncommon depth of feeling. According to primary sources, Lincoln and Emerson met only once, January 16, 1862. Emerson, by then a famous lecturer, had just delivered an address at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. History did not record any profound exchanges from that evening, only that Emerson was more impressed with the president than he expected, and Lincoln praised Emerson's call for immediate emancipation. And yet, by the time that they shook hands, they had buried between them 8 grandparents, 4 parents, 1 wife, 5 brothers, 1 sister, 3 sons, 1 fiancé, and countless friends. Not exactly the stuff we teach our kids about Honest Abe. Not exactly the context in which most of us read Emerson. But how could those 2 men experience so much loss and not be changed? Robert Richardson begins what many scholars believe is the best biography to date on Emerson, The Mind on Fire. Here we see the almost surreal episode in which, this is 1832, in which the 28-year-old Emerson goes to the tomb of his beloved wife, Ellen. And once there, he opens the coffin lid. And Richardson tells us Emerson's impulse was not as nearly as uncommon in those times, but nonetheless gives a window into his deep suffering. Richardson could begin his book with something more predictable, chronological account, thundering Emerson at the height of his abilities. But instead, he opts for the scene of a grieving and rudderless husband, so bereft that he wants just to be with his wife no matter what. Come forward again, this time by 9 years. Because by now, Emerson has abandoned the ministry and had some success as a writer, a lecturer, editor. He's remarried, has children, has become a New England celebrity. By most measures, his circumstances have improved. Yet in his letter to a friend, he complains about the weather and his lack of writing ability. Aware that he is once again in the grasp of melancholy, he adds the phrase, "Lately it is sort of general winter with me." It's clear that he had by that time ceased to resist the reality of his depression, opting instead to live with it. Whether he was afflicted with a biochemical imbalance, burdened by the gross accumulation of loss and grief, or some combination thereof, Emerson, like his contemporary Lincoln, chose to live with his nearly perpetual winter. Waldo was born on May 5th, 1803 in Boston, His mother, Ruth Haskins Emerson, was Anglican. She was an avid reader. She was the moral glue for her family. Emerson credited her with teaching him the importance of a personal religious experience. This was in contrast to his father, whose Unitarian ministry and rational approach to religion were typical of the day. His father, like his mother, had an appetite for reading, despite their differences, and that reading would be passed on to their children. William died of tuberculosis in 1811. Emerson's paternal aunt, Mary Moody Emerson, was a major influence throughout his life. She saw in her nephew the goodness and potential Emerson still questioned. Emerson did not distinguish himself as a student, either in his childhood or at Harvard. He began college at 14 and was better known for skipping classes than to enjoy nature than any academic accomplishment. And much of his poor performance at Harvard had to do with his admitted inability to decide what he wanted to do. On the one hand, he was attracted by the ministry and its regular income and rhythms. On the other, his heart was really in poetry and writing and lecturing. But Emerson kept reading, for he had an insatiable thirst for knowledge. He read from the Greek classics, Roman mythology. He read theology, science, fiction, poetry, philosophy, history. And not long after entering Harvard, Ralph decided to use Waldo as his first name. And although he was not exactly the life of any party, he did begin to make a few friends, some of whom he visited between Boston and Florida on a trip designed to help him recover from recurring poor health. And touching again on the topic of his melancholy, Emerson could not be happy even on the serene beaches of Florida. He wrote, "Decay. Decay is written on every leaf of the forest. Every wind that passes is loaded with a solemn sound, singing, 'All things must perish.'" This is Emerson's winter. It's worth noting Emerson's theology was aligned with the liberals that were leaving Congregationalism for the fledgling Unitarian fold, but he was adamant about the existence of an external God, the importance of Scripture, and immortality of the soul. Keep in mind, he was for some time under the influence of the famous, formidable writer and minister William Ellery Channing. So these beliefs were his beliefs, even though they would soon undergo transformation as he encountered Hinduism and Buddhism. Emerson fell in love with Ellen Louisa Tucker sometime in 1827 or 1828. She was 16, lived in Concord, New Hampshire, loved the outdoors and horseback riding. Was already showing symptoms, however, of tuberculosis. After a 2-year courtship, the couple married, and Emerson accepted a call to Second Church in Boston. He found preaching daunting but stimulating. Not so the other task of parish ministry. So by the fall of 1830, Ellen's recurring bouts with tuberculosis were worsening, weighing down Emerson's heart, his mind, and his writing. Once again, winter had found Emerson. Ellen died on February 8th, 1831. And not long thereafter, Emerson wrote he was unstrung, debilitated by grief, and his life had become unrepaired regret and miserable apathy. Emerson's poetry and studies became the primary outlet for that grief, prompting a return to ministry. But while he was a much more social animal than most think, his introversion did make for a difficult match. Time requires a quick summary of the next several years of Emerson's intellectual life. Suffice it to say, his mind was on fire with ideas. German scholarship was changing his views on biblical authority. He was fascinated with astronomy. He was attracted to Quakerism for its simplicity and coherence. The parish was just too confining, so before he got fired, he resigned for good in 1832. And now here is Emerson, no longer able to call himself a Christian, let alone a minister. His moods varied from content to forlorn, and he too became ill. And a journal entry from that time is testimony to his sense of being lost, and yet somehow free. He wrote, "It is awful to look into the mind of," and here's the sexist language, "of man, and see just how free we are, to what frightful excesses our vices may run under the whited walls of a respectable reputation. And outside among your fellows, among strangers, you must preserve appearances, 100 things you cannot do. But inside you is that terrible freedom." Declaring himself free from what he would later famously call corpse-cold Unitarianism, Emerson decided in 1822 to travel to Malta and Sicily and Italy and Switzerland and France and England, and then return to Massachusetts about a year later. And now, these European awakenings had to be synthesized, something to do with what he once believed, but no longer did. So he took up an interest in the writings of the Quaker George Fox, Unitarian Frederick Hedge. And as Robert Richardson points out in his biography of Emerson, if there is a single moment after which American transcendentalism can said to exist, it is when Emerson read Hedge's manifesto, because for Emerson, what the Quakers called the inner light, Hedge called reason. This is an apparent contradiction, but not for Emerson. In a letter from Emerson to his brother Edward, he wrote, "Reason is the real faculty of the soul. What we often mean by the soul itself, it never reasons, it never proves, it simply perceives. Reason is vision, and vision is reason." And thus for Emerson, there is in you and me the capacity to follow what is our natural, reasonable instinct for religion. Call it the inner light, call it the oversoul, as he did, or just call it reason. Emerson called this combination true religion. It was a religion that transcends reason. As the year 1835 took shape, Emerson had, yes, forsaken Christianity for a religion. It was a religion of and in nature. For him, the life source in nature is the same life force that beats in the breast of each person. It was a theology that spoke to his mind, but also came to comfort him when these spiritual winters returned. As you might expect now, professionally, he was both cherished and despised for leaving institutional Unitarianism. He would never be financially secure, and he would encounter many other hardships, including the passing of his dear friend Margaret Fuller. But he would never again settle for borrowed religion. As included in Richardson's biography, Emerson declared, "Henceforth, I decide not to utter any speech, poem, or book that is not entirely and peculiarly my own." One more time. "Henceforth, I decide not to utter any speech, poem, or book that is not entirely and peculiarly my work." This is the Emerson, still born of winter, but standing strong in his own power. That's as good a stopping place as any place. Point so far is probably obvious. Even those, maybe particularly those, we crown as our spiritual giants, they're really overcomers. Their measure of joys and sorrows might amount to no more than yours or mine. But whatever their measure, they find a way to rise above. They find a way. And because they rise, because they find a way, we boldly believe that we can do likewise. And that's when we call forth that word courage. When we call forth courage, we call forth yet another. It is the prize of all prizes in life. we learn how to hope. At the UU Fellowship of Hendersonville, it is our custom to do some small group sharing each Sunday at 11:30 a.m. Eastern. And we center the sharing around a question or two, but of course not everybody watching today's service will be there. So let me close by posing the simple questions for this week's gathering. First, what is there about Emerson, as I described him, that resonates with you? What in his life resonates with yours? And then secondly, what creative gift, however small or large, do you give to the world despite your own struggles? Again, what creative gift, however small or large, do you give to the world despite your own struggles? Those are the questions. So we'll pick up Emerson again on December 20. In the meantime, thanks as always for tuning in. We appreciate it.
As always, thank you so much for spending time with us today. We hope this reflection on Emerson's humanity will encourage you as you walk your own path. We close with these words from our interim minister, Don Rollins. None of us is just one thing, one person. No, we are many things and have lived many lives. Blessed and burdened alike, we now behold one another in kaleidoscope form. Freed from the grainy grays of assumptions, we at last see the burdens and pain that are our common lot. The preacher still ascends to his pulpit. The poet still reaches for her pen. Yet they also dread and weep and pine, longing for their jagged wholeness. You are more than I thought, they say. I am more than you thought, they tell us. You and I, we are many things. We have lived many lives. May peace be with you.